moving to the platform. I'm losing my voice. I've been there for a week. Look at that. Just give you the highlights. Marian and her husband, David. David's here, right? David, stand up. Hoorah. Welcome, sir. They live very close by, probably only a few miles. The name of the place is Rockbridge Baths. Is that right? Right. And they're both brainiacs, PhDs, both of them. Degrees from Washington State. That's it. University. Hers in English, his in math. And David was a member of 367 Basis School. That's good. I want to turn this on. Served as a junior infantry officer with 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. Later on with 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines in different infantry jobs. One of the key points here is to recognize her work, her first book, Lonely Girls with Burning Eyes. I hope you're going to talk about that a little bit.
A little bit.
Anyway, she's a freelance writer, a wonderful lady. Please put your hands together.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say how awed I am and humbled to be surrounded here by all these great reminders of duty and courage, and to also be facing living reminders of all that duty and courage. I'm here to tell you a small part of the story of those who wait on the home front, and many are waiting even as we speak now. 50 years ago this August, I married Marine Lieutenant William David Novak in Tacoma, Washington. In October, we were in Virginia, where my husband, called Dave, joined the basic school class that would graduate in March 1967, TBS 367. At basic school, Dave spent long weekday hours training with the other Marines in his platoon, a few of whom were like him, married. I came to know other wives through social activities, some organized, such as dress balls and wives' meetings, others informal, such as weekend gatherings in the club at Waller Hall, mostly in the basement, or at someone's apartment. On May 1st, 1967, I saw my husband off to war at Travis Air Force Base in Fairfield, California. I would wait for him in the safety and security of a peaceful America, staying on the West Coast. My turns with Dave's parents in Tacoma and my own in Fresno. A postcard from Dave's layover in Hawaii quickly arrived in the mailbox in Fresno, followed immediately by 2 letters from Okinawa. None, however, had a return address. In one of these letters, Dave wrote that he'd played poker in Okinawa with 3 classmates from TBS, among them a Marine I'll call Sam, one of the married men in the platoon at Quantico Dave had belonged to. On May 6th, I was thrilled to receive a letter from Da Nang with a return address. At last, Dave and I could begin to communicate. But when I sat down that night to answer my husband, I discovered that communicating with him by letter was going to be much harder than I'd thought. We dated seriously just 3 months before becoming engaged, and we were engaged only 2.5 months before we married. Other than telling Dave that I loved him and missed him, I didn't really know what to say to him. Since we'd planned for the baby we expected in July to be born in Dave's hometown, on May 8th, I flew from Fresno to Tacoma. I quickly settled into a routine of writing to Dave, preparing a nursery, and reconnecting with the other wives I'd come to know and care about at Quantico. We were now scattered across the United States. Letters from Dave began to arrive immediately in the mailbox in Tacoma. He was very happy with his platoon, 1st Platoon, Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. And he clearly loved being with them in the field. In a short letter of May 18th, he wrote, "We're going out on another operation, not a dangerous one." On the morning of May 20th, I happened to glance out the large window of the living room in my in-laws' home. A tan car sat in the driveway, and a tall Marine with oak leaf emblems on his collar was walking up the walk. I was stunned. It was all I could do to unlatch the screen door. At Quantico, we wives had been told to expect a phone call or a telegram if a husband were wounded. If the worst happened, that a husband had been killed, an officer would come to the door, with a chaplain if possible. And here was an officer, alone, but he was a major, wearing a serious expression, and he held papers in his hand. After a few seemingly endless moments of confusion and terror on my part, things were cleared up. Dave was only wounded, and not badly. He would be in the hospital at Da Nang for 2 weeks where I could write to him. I was beyond relieved and happy. My husband was alive. I wanted to run out into the street and tell everyone I saw. Very soon, a letter came from Dave, written on Red Cross stationery. I opened this eagerly. It obviously held news about what had happened, but I was bitterly disappointed. "I'm back off that operation I was talking about," Dave wrote. Then he continued with praise for his men. "They're youngsters," he said, "but real professionals. They've taken good care of me." And my husband closed with, "I'll probably get a chance to write tomorrow." Not a word about what I wanted and needed to know. And the letter I received the following day, again on Red Cross stationery, was the same, except this one ended. "Nothing much new over here." In a letter mailed May 29th, Dave wrote that he was back in the field. He said he wished he could lead his platoon the whole 13 months, but since he was due to be put up for captain, that would not be possible. "Though it will be months before I get the promotion," he added hopefully. Again, not a word about being wounded. Finally, Dave knew that I knew. On June 8th, he mailed a letter with some details. His wound was from a round he took from a sniper on a platoon sweep. The bullet went through his upper right arm and embedded in his flak jacket, which prevented it from penetrating his chest. He'd gotten bored, that was his word, and had left the hospital without a weapon before he was supposed to, hitchhiking back to his unit. His wound was almost healed. Very soon after receiving this letter, I heard through the wives that Walter Lyons, a bachelor from our husband's platoon, had been killed in action in mid-June. Another loss quickly followed. Sam, the basic school friend Dave had seen in Okinawa, was killed in action the first week of July. Our daughter was born on July 25th, and Sam's widow had Sam's baby only days later. In early September, another of the men from the platoon, Denny Donald Peterson, was killed in a firefight. For his actions that day, Denny was awarded the Navy Cross. Though unmarried, Denny had spent a lot of his social time with the married couples. We wives now lived in a world of sorrow, each of us with her own special fears. One of mine was tan cars. Since the major's visit that morning in late May, I could not see a tan car anywhere without my blood turning cold. If I spotted one on the road when I was out, I followed it, even making a U-turn if I have to, until I knew it was not going to the neighborhood where I lived. In the fall, I returned to Fresno. There, as in Tacoma, I watched television news of the fighting in Vietnam, and I followed the first Marines on a map of that country I kept taped to my closet door, one that showed I Corps in detail. And I watched news footage of the anti-war demonstrations. In Fresno, my school teacher mother and my professor father were openly hostile to the Vietnam War. And my mother was especially disapproving of Dave's involvement. She was encouraging, even helping young men on their way to Canada, boys she'd taught, 2 of whom I'd gone to school with. Still, my parents wanted to help. My father, who could arrange his own class schedule, offered to babysit while I attended classes at Fresno State. Remembering other college days, I was very excited to be on a campus again. But Fresno isn't far in distance in thinking from Berkeley, where anti-war feelings had been gaining strength for a long time. That fall, the country seemed to erupt. Even on the campus at Fresno State, I soon came to fear that someone would learn that my husband was a Marine in Vietnam. So at school, I stayed apart from my classmates, and at home, I avoided deep conversations with my parents. In the evening, I wrote to Dave in Vietnam, and always I waited and hoped for letters. Now and then we wives made what were at the time expensive phone calls to one another, but mostly we wrote letters and sent cards. All of these helped immensely with the loneliness and sense of isolation. One of our good topics was that strange time out from war when we would meet our husbands for a few days of rest and recreation. It was called R&R. As you can imagine, most of our talk on this subject was happy planning. But one of us, who was teaching in the Midwest, was having trouble getting leave for R&R. At last, her school board decided that if she would arrange for and pay for her own substitute, they would grant her a week to go meet her husband for what might well be his last time to see her. I don't think that could happen today, but it could, and it did then. Dave and I began R&R in Hawaii on what in Vietnam was November 10th, 1967, the 192nd birthday of the United States Marine Corps. Those 5 days and 6 nights were more a respite for me than they were for Dave. I'd brought our baby to meet her father, so the ones I worried about were with me. I was free from worrying that my daughter might be missing her mother, but most of all, I was free from thinking that at any one moment my husband might be dead and I would not know. For 132 hours, I knew exactly where he was, and every moment he was with me, I felt he was safe. Dave, on the other hand, seemed remote at times. A big part of him hadn't left Vietnam, and another part did not want to go back. One blessing was that although he still worried about the men in his platoon, Dave was no longer responsible for them. Though not informed until October, he'd been promoted to captain back on July 1st. In October, he was reassigned to battalion headquarters in Quang Tri City as a civil affairs officer. I was very pleased that my husband was out of the field, and though Dave himself was deeply disappointed, he set to work at his new job. He saw that wells were dug and showers were built in neighboring villages, all according to the specifications of the regimental surgeon. In late November, still in civil affairs, Dave was moved to 1st Marines regimental headquarters in the same area. Civil affairs collected $1,000 in donations from the 1st Marines to buy material for school uniforms for the children, and they held a Christmas party for them. Sometime in January 1968, the regiment moved to Phu-Bai. Dave wrote that he'd be doing the same civil affairs work that he'd done in Quang Tri. Meanwhile, I finished the semester, and at the end of January, I returned to the relative peace of Tacoma to wait for Dave, who would be home in June. In his letter to me of January 29th, Dave told me of going to Hue that day with the regimental doctor to get serum for vaccinating children. He'd seen some beautiful buildings in Hue, the Citadel and a Catholic cathedral where a priest had given him a rosary. When I go back, he said, I'll get better pictures. Life seemed to be getting a little easier for both of us for only a few days. And then there was Tet. And the news reports that the 1st Marine Regiment was right in the middle of it in Hue City. Would they have headquarters company with them, I wondered? As the battle raged, 2 letters Dave had written in the first week of February arrived in Tacoma. One was a typical letter about mundane things, car insurance, things like that. The other was a short note saying he loved me and that he was safe at Phu Bai. On what was in the States Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1968, I answered the phone in my mother-in-law's kitchen. The man on the line introduced himself as a ham radio operator calling from Texas. This operator was one of those wonderful volunteers, among them Senator Barry Goldwater, who made thousands of such calls possible. This operator told me that he was patching a call through to me from Vietnam. Then I heard Dave's voice from Hue. He'd been there almost a week, he said, spending nights at the MAC-V compound, where there was a military radio system. Don't worry, he told me, nothing's going on here. Would I be calling you if anything were going on here? We spoke for only a very few difficult minutes over a crackling wire, having to remember to say over when we finished a sentence. But I heard a strange booming thunder in the background. This phone call was the last I was to hear from Dave for more than 2 weeks. In Tacoma, I watched the war news in addition to vivid battle reports and the relentless body counts. It now also centered on 2 major themes: the wrongness of the whole enterprise and the growing resistance against it. By the end of February, the battle for Hue was essentially over, and on March 5th, the 1st Marines returned to Phu Bai. Dave's letters began to arrive regularly again, but they seemed to come from another universe, a universe where there was no war at all. In fact, they said nothing at all revealing, with one exception, a letter he'd written in Hue, in which Dave made it clear that he'd become dispirited. He was tired of sea rats, tired of being dirty, tired of the Vietnamese, tired of the country, tired of the war. I'd apparently asked him for details about the Tet Offensive that had dominated the news, because he wrote that the fighting there had nothing to do with him. But it seems I pressed, because he later wrote, I was just fooling around in Hue. During the first week of April, the 1st Air Cavalry Division and the 1st Marines opened Route 9 and relieved the Marines under siege at Quai Son. In the first of his April letters, Dave told me that he was now the Marine liaison officer to the Air Cav, but he was not going to the beleaguered base. These April letters had a new twist on an old refrain. Safe at Phu Bai was replaced with I'm safe in a bunker at Ka Lu. Only days before the Marines at Quai Son were relieved, I was informed in a heartbreaking call from one of the wives that we'd lost another of the husbands from the Quantico platoon. This one killed in action at Quai Son. Dave was very fond of Ken, and I hated writing to him that Ken was gone. It took my sad news 11 days to reach my husband, who, though he had not told me, was by then himself at that very base. In none of his April letters did Dave even hint at where he was or what he was doing. He would only admit to being with the 1st Marines in the war zone, but safe, once even safe at a desk. Don't pay any attention to news reports, he warned me in another letter. They have a way of getting things wrong. However, with the help of these news reports and my by now very marked up map, I'd become pretty good at figuring out my husband's whereabouts. I'd also learned to take what comfort I could in holding the envelopes and the pages he'd touched. They sometimes had their own story to tell. I must have asked Dave why his mail to me was so stained with red dust when he was supposedly safe at a desk, because he wrote, I don't know why my letters are covered in red dust. I suppose the mailbags are dusty inside. In the last letter from me to reach Dave before he left for Da Nang and then home, I wrote, "In a matter of days, all this hell will be behind us." In his last letter to me before leaving, Dave, finally admitting where he'd been, wrote, "I'm sure glad to leave that hellhole they call Quezon." We were elated. We could now pick up where we left off before May 1967, when we entered the world of Vietnam. From Da Nang, my husband arrived home with little more than a musty olive green duffel bag that held all of the possessions he'd owned in country: uniform pieces, muddy boots, a few mementos, and a small, resealable plastic bag that at one long ago time held new envelopes. It was now worn and very stained with that red dirt. In Vietnam, Dave kept my most recent 2 or 3 letters in this to keep them from rotting, throwing these away when new ones arrived. The letters inside the plastic bag pictured here are the last from me to reach him before he left for home. They are all that survived the war from the far more than 300 he received from me. Dave arrived home May 30th, 1968, and he left the Marine Corps in the fall of 1969. He decided to return to school for another degree. On campus, the heroes of the war were the protesters, while the men who'd served were, in those days, nothing of the kind. We rarely mentioned Dave's service. In 1976, he accepted a teaching position in Massachusetts, one that was offered in spite of the chairman's voiced hesitation about hiring a Vietnam veteran, and most worrisome of all, a combat Marine. Soon Dave began to struggle with memories of the war. At first, he wouldn't acknowledge a problem, except in the nightmares I had to wake him from. In the early March of 1983, we went to the wall in Washington, D.C. We were alone there that morning. Back in Massachusetts, I bought a scrapbook for the photographs and clippings I was gathering. The war Dave and I had determined to put behind us was once more taking center stage in our lives. In other places, Vietnam veterans built other memorials to honor their fallen. I was dismayed that those old familiar anti-Vietnam War attitudes persisted, especially the ones that sometimes seemed to focus on the warriors. In this 1983 article, a Boston Herald reporter writes, "Vietnam War veterans are keeping an around-the-clock vigil at a Lynn, Massachusetts memorial to their fallen comrades after the 2-month-old monument was twice defaced with red paint and stickers branding the vets baby killers. The men scrubbed for hours last Friday after the first attack and Wednesday when it happened once again." In 1985, 10 years after the surrender of Saigon to communist forces, a more benign attention turned toward the Vietnam War and its warriors. People magazine marked that anniversary year by running a series of stories featuring notable photographs from the war, some of them difficult. The April photograph was of several wounded from Alpha Company 1-5 who were being transported down a street to an aid station during the Battle for Hue. "Help us identify these men," the magazine asked. Within the month, they'd received over 100 responses and had identified 5 of the men. In public, Dave's silence about his war experience seemed to grow more profound. To put it quite mildly, the academics we spent our work and leisure time with were not connected to the Vietnam War in the same ways we were. Unless you were a Vietnam veteran against the war, nothing at all seemed to intersect. By now, we'd lost touch with most of what remained of the Quantico group. But Dave began to associate with local Marines of any kind and with other veterans of Vietnam from all branches of the service. He joined the 2-1 reunion group. Though more comfortable in the company of these fellow veterans, like many of them, Dave kept his most important war stories to himself. In 1988, the 20th anniversary year of the Tet Offensive and the Battle for Hue, my scrapbook began to overflow with Vietnam-related pieces. This clipping from that year bothered me. I was unhappy to see that the attention to the war, though benign, was now aggressively so. It had the scent of pity. In this article, a Boston Herald columnist writes as someone who most certainly had never waited for a loved one at war in Vietnam, or anywhere else for that matter. In 1968, she says, "The war didn't dominate life. In the foreground were weddings and graduations. Life went on." However, she argues that 20 years after Tet, it's time to recognize those men who did their duty in Vietnam, though not by honoring or even accepting them, but by helping the disturbed homeless among them. I can't say for sure why the fight for Hue during Tet of 1968 stands out for me from all the other events of the American War in Vietnam. Perhaps it's just as some argue that something bigger than a terrible battle took place. Perhaps it's that we won a hard-fought victory in the bloody streets of Hue in February of 1968 and left that victory on the table. I began to feel that things were not right or just, and this feeling of injustices having been done was very unsettling. The late short story writer and essayist Andre Dubus, the Elder, who was also a dedicated former peacetime Marine and a friend of my husband, noticed this disquiet in me and encouraged me to write about it. "You write," he said, "and I'll listen to you read what you've written." This is the first page of the first result of Dubus's encouragement, an article that appeared in the New York Times Magazine in December of 1988. When I pointed out to the editor that not one of my husband's letters was postmarked Vietnam, I was told the Times liked the title and it would stay. I think they were right. Although not an historically accurate title, it's a significant one. It captures the essence of my world for 13 months of the years 1967 and 1968. Another result of Andre Dubus's encouragement was a short story I wrote about a Vietnam veteran who, much to his wife's dismay, remained silent about his experiences during the war. Believing it would be good for him, her, and their marriage, she insists that her husband share his memories with her. When he finally does, she is the one left mute. The title I gave this work is A Real Story. Essays and other stories about men, women, and war quickly followed. I'd found a way of dealing with my disquiet. In 1993, the 25th anniversary year of the Tet Offensive, a friend at the Naval Institute who knew Dave had been in Hue then asked him to write about his experience there for Naval History magazine. Surprisingly, Dave agreed. He called his article Back to Hue. Dave worked through many drafts of his story, writing about the meanest and hardest kind of fighting being done by other Marines in Hue. Men like his Quantico platoon mate Jay Olsner. Dave also wrote about burying rotten bodies in Hue and about watching helplessly as trapped POWs burned to death there. And as he struggled to find the right words to hold his meaning, my husband seemed to arrive at a peace, not only with the horror that was his own particular experience in Hue, but with all aspects of his war. We have now, both of us, told our stories, or we have told many of them. We have shared some in print, others we tell only to one another, often in the dead of night when it's hard to sleep. The process doesn't end. The poet John Donne wrote that more than kisses, letters mingle souls. But before souls can mingle, there has to be, I think, some element of a mutual understanding that comes from a more profound familiarity than the one we possessed. We were young and only just beginning to learn about each other when Dave went to war, leaving me on the home front to face a different country than the one I'd been raised in, where apart from his letters, My only real comfort came from those dear young women, those other young wives. When Dave came home from Vietnam, we'd lived apart more than we'd lived together. We were still strangers, recently separated by time and place, and now also by our different wars. I think that together we've come a long way to make up these failings we had as young people, newly married and separated by a terrible event. We know now that our experiences during those 13 months of war are important parts of who we are, and we finally learned to share them with understanding and compassion. Now, 2 postscripts. This first is about another important anniversary of the Vietnam War. This is a recent photograph of one of my 11 grandchildren. Her other grandmother is South Vietnamese. On the morning of last April 30th, my son-in-law in Texas received a message from an aunt in which she said, "Today is the 40th anniversary of the day my father ran into our house in Vietnam and cried out, 'We must leave now.'" The family left Vietnam in a U.S. Navy ship, and after many, many months in camps, they finally came to America. They had lost their home. They had lost everything. The father of my son-in-law's aunt was a policeman in South Vietnam, and until the last days of the country called South Vietnam, her uncle served in the South Vietnamese military. The family loved their country, and they cherished their way of life there, and they had fought long and hard to keep it. They had to begin all over in a strange land where the word that my granddaughter has been taught by her father means great feast and holiday celebration, means to many of her fellow Americans terrible, defining battle, or turning point, or even lost victory. I want all of my grandchildren to know everything that Tet means. And now I'll give a Marine named Dennis Ray Omert the last word. Dennis was one of those wounded Marines of Alpha Company 1-5 who were photographed on the carrier in Hue during Tet of 1968, and he was one of the 5 who were identified by readers of People magazine in 1985. Dennis's earthly remains have rested at Arlington since the fall of 2014, where the brief epitaph on his simple government issue marker reads, 1968, Hue City survivor, Semper Fi. Thank you.